Good morning, guys. Today we are going to talk about imperialism in Japan and how that played out. And today is going to be a little bit different than the other areas where we saw imperialism happen, because Japan is actually going to become an imperialistic power. So the first thing I want to make sure that you've done is you have filled out the top of your notes. Make sure that you put the topic, because I have not put that for you this time. It's imperialism Japan. And then your EQ, why did Japan become an imperialist? Okay, so as you need to, please stop the video, rewatch things as you need, look more stuff up if you're confused about something. These are your notes, so you need to personalize them so you understand and can make the most out of it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So Japan is a little different because they had seen what was happening around the world and how the European nations were setting up colonies in all different places for all different kinds of reasons. But ultimately, it was so that the mother country, the European country, would get more powerful, more wealthy. So Japan thought, well, if you can't beat them, why not join them? So Japan, this whole time, was free of European control because of two main reasons. Okay, number one, it looked at the West, right, the Western part of the world that was modern and had all these new things, and it modeled their country after what they saw in the West. So they looked at the West and modeled after them. And number two, they modernized their nation very quickly. So they looked and they saw what was happening and they're like, ooh, we need to do that here. And they were quick about it, right? They weren't dragging their feet about it. So because Japan learned Western ways so well and so quickly, it actually became an imperialistic power. And they weren't taken as land to put colonies on, which is huge because in Africa, they put colonies there. In India, we see European countries came over there and put colonies. Japan said, we don't want that. So instead of them taking advantage of us, we need to make sure we're powerful so we can go get colonies. So it's important to know how Japan had been before this, okay? So for much of Japanese history, which you even saw in 6th grade, they had closed themselves off from the rest of the world. They closed themselves off from outsiders, okay? They didn't want anyone to come into their countries and try and change things, so they locked themselves in, I guess you could say. However, in the mid-1800s, the United States decides to force an end to Japan's isolation. Isolation means they're by themselves. The U.S. said, we don't want that. We want to trade with them. We're going to make them open their country up so we can trade with them. So their goal was to open trade with Japan. How they do this, okay? Now listen to how this sounds and tell me if this sounds like this is a really friendly way of asking or if it's kind of more of a threatening way. Okay, so the U.S. goes over there with this letter, this nice written letter asking to trade with Japan, and the U.S. sends a fleet of 4 warships to Japan to give this letter to the Japanese emperor. Okay, they send 4 warships. Number one, they're warships. Number two, it takes all this to send a letter just asking to trade with Japan. You think about that. In the letter, it demanded that Japan open trading up with the U.S., and there was a promise in there that the U.S. would return for an answer because they wanted to desperately trade with Japan. So if you think about what that looked like it was more of a threat than it was a request. And Japan saw that too. And so Japan decided that they couldn't win against the U.S. power. So after 6 months, the United States returns just like promised, but this time with a even larger fleet of warships, okay? And they get their answer. The Japanese government agreed to a treaty with the United States. However, because now they've opened up to trading with the United States, that then forces Japan to sign treaties with other major European nations. Okay, so they have been isolated this whole time. The U.S. makes them open up to trade with them, and also that brings other European countries to trade with them too. So Japan starts to kind of change its mindset. They had always been run by different dynasties, the Shogun dynasties that you probably remember in 6th grade, and they decide that they need to change the way things had been. So this calls the Meiji Restoration. And the time period is from 1868 to 1912. But not all Japanese people were happy with or pleased or happy with these new agreements. So they knew that they could not defeat the Westerners, so they had to change things. So the Meiji Restoration means enlightened rule, right? And we saw the Enlightenment, it's the same thing. Enlightenment means you're bringing new ideas, you're broadening horizons, okay? In a sense, if you want to think of it, getting smarter about how you do things. So during this time period, the Japanese officials begin to modernize and westernize the nation of Japan. They carefully and systematically, which means, step by step, they studied Western technology. They studied the science and political things and the economic ideas that the West was doing. And because of that, this made Japan an industrial nation. They start becoming, I guess you could say, like a mini European country, a mini US is what they're trying to do, because they see that the European countries are powerful. They see that the US has become powerful. So they start to look at what the rest of the world is doing. So the Japanese government models their government style from Germany and France. They modernize their they modernize their country by copying the British. And they improve their education, their public education, and model that after the United States. So Japan becomes the leading producer then of silk cloth, which silk was huge if you think back to the civilizations in 6th grade. They are the big producers of steel, ships, and also weapons. And that's really important to remember later on as we go a little bit further in history about that. The Japanese railroad and the telegraph system were created, so they were transporting things along their country much faster and more efficiently. They were communicating more efficiently. They also set up a modern army and a navy, and they put a rule in place, a law in place that said that all men had to serve in the Japanese army for at least 3 years, okay? So that really quickly boosts up their army. For public education, some changes that they made there. First off, they were going to educate all boys and girls, and it was required for 6 years that they needed to get an education. They taught them the same subjects as other countries, like reading, math, and all that. But then they also taught them traditional Japanese values. So even though they were trying to be like the rest of the world, they also tried to keep piece of their old traditional Japanese ways, because they didn't want to lose every part of themselves, which is important to note. However, Japan had some problems. Japan they did not have a lot of natural resources like coal. You need coal to run these big factories that they were wanting to make and have in their country. And that's needed for industry. So they began thinking, if they got colonies, that could provide Japan with a source of raw materials. We saw that happen in India. We saw that happen in Africa. So Japan's like, that's a good idea. Also, the colonies could then provide a larger market for them to sell their Japanese goods to people. So instead of just selling Japanese goods within their own country, if they had colonies, they could sell their Japanese goods there too. So that's another plus. However, one of their big problems was if they decided to become this huge industrial power, Japan was a string of islands, right? They're their own island country. They have lots of other little islands around them that the population was living on. So if Japan if their population grew because of industrialization, they would have more workers, which they would need and which would be positive, but they would have nowhere to live. So they said, well, we need colonies to move some of our population there. So again, it looked to them like this was the only option they had if they wanted to succeed. So Japan starts to have battles, and they win land through battles with Russia, China, and Korea, which is huge. And the interesting thing here is we saw what the European countries did to other nations that they imperialized, and Japan actually did that to Korea, what Western nations were doing to other parts of the world. The places where they would set up their colonies, they forced Japanese language to be learned and used. They forced the Japanese culture. All the money that was made in those colonies went to the Japanese, not to the colonies themselves. So Japan has become an imperialistic power. So their motto was, we don't want someone to control us, so we need to become powerful so we can take control. And we're going to see how that plays out for the rest of the Japanese history up to today later on. If you need to go back, please watch any part of this. Look up more information if you need it. I know it was kind of fast today, so make sure you use this time to reflect on your notes.